The Elven Princess and the Crystal Garden. The twilight hours stretched long over the Silver Glade, the forests and rivers soaked in the somber hues of a dying sun. Princess Elaria stood at the arched window of her chamber, her gaze fixed upon the horizon. The world beyond seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the shadow that had crept into the royal halls. Inside, an oppressive silence reigned, broken only by the shallow, uneven breaths of her brother. Prince Kael lay upon a bed of silken leaves, his once bright eyes dulled to a pale grey that mirrored the colour of winter's sky. His laughter, once the melody of the palace, was now a memory fading into the corners of Elaria's mind. The healers had come and gone, their faces masks of sorrow and failure, their whispered condolences hanging in the air like unspoken curses. It was an elder of the court, gnarled and stooped with age, who finally spoke of the forbidden cure. His voice, though low, carried a weight that silenced the chamber. "There is one hope," he began, his words slow as though they carried the weight of centuries. "The bloom of Lumina, a flower of unearthly beauty and power. It resides deep within the Crystal Garden, a place no elf treads lightly." Elaria's breath caught, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had heard the tales of the Crystal Garden as a child, stories of a place where time warped, where crystalline plants gleamed like stars, and where guardians of untold power watched over the treasures within. The garden, it was said, chose its visitors. Those deemed unworthy would never return. The elder's clouded eyes found hers. The garden's trials are not of strength, but of spirit. Courage and compassion are your only armor. If you fail... He did not finish. He did not need to. The night deepened, wrapping the Silver Glade in an ink-black shroud, and Elaria made a decision. She could not sit idly by while Kael's light flickered, could not bear to see the shadow of grief claim their parents. Resolute, she donned a cloak of twilight blue, its fabric whispering softly against her as she moved. Around her neck, she wore a simple pendant, a gift from Kael when they were but children exploring the woods together. It gleamed faintly, a beacon of her purpose. She sought her mother, Queen Elaria, in the moonlit gardens of the palace. The queen, ethereal even in her sorrow, stood among the night-blooming flowers, her silver hair glinting like a cascade of stars. Elaria knelt before her, her voice steady but soft. "Mother, I must go." The queen turned, her luminous eyes searching Elaria's face. There was no need for explanation. The bond between mother and daughter carried the words unsaid. A tear slid down Elaria's cheek, but she nodded. "The path is yours to tread," she whispered. "But tread it wisely, my daughter. The garden does not test lightly." As the first light of dawn pierced the horizon, Elaria set forth. Guided by an ancient map, etched onto a fragment of crystal, a relic of their ancestors, she traversed through forests, thick with whispering leaves and valleys steeped in mist. The world seemed to shift around her as she walked, the familiar paths twisting into unfamiliar patterns. The air changed as she neared her destination. It grew heavier, laden with a hum she could feel in her very bones. It was as though the earth itself vibrated in anticipation, the song of the crystal garden calling to her. At last, she reached it. The threshold of the garden was marked by an archway unlike anything she had ever seen. Made entirely of crystal, it refracted the rising sun's light into a cascade of colors, each hue alive with its own flickering pulse. Beyond the arch, the garden stretched in all its enigmatic glory. Trees of glass-like bark towered over crystalline flowers that swayed without wind, their petals shimmering like frost-kissed jewels. Elaria paused at the threshold, her breath caught in her throat. This was a realm untouched by the natural order, a place where the rules of reality bent to something greater, something ancient. Steeling herself, she stepped through the arch. Behind her, the air rang with a crystalline chime, and the arch sealed itself with a shimmer of light. There would be no turning back. The garden had claimed her now. The first guardian stirred. The moment Elaria passed through the crystalline arch, she felt the world shift. The ground beneath her feet became smooth and cold, a path of interlocking crystal shards that sang faintly with each step she took. The air was different here, denser, as though the garden itself breathed with a rhythm that matched her own. Colors shifted in the periphery of her vision, hues she could not name, their brilliance both mesmerizing and disorienting. Above her, the sky was a kaleidoscope of fractured light, a dome of shifting prisms that let in neither sun nor moon. Time felt suspended, its usual flow replaced by something less linear, more sentient. Elaria clutched her cloak closer, her fingers brushing against the pendant around her neck, a touchstone of familiarity in a place that seemed to defy reality itself. The silence here was not the stillness of emptiness, but a quiet, brimming with intent. The garden was alive, watching her with unseen eyes. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She had entered its domain, and it was aware. The path before her forked into three. Each route led into a dense cluster of crystalline flora, their edges sharp and gleaming like frozen flames. As Elaria hesitated, the air around her shimmered, and from the center of the crossroads emerged a figure. It was the first guardian. Towering over her, the guardian was a construct of glass and shadow, its form both solid and ephemeral. Its limbs refracted the garden's light, splitting it into countless rainbows that danced across the crystalline trees. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, an absence so profound it drew Elaria's gaze against her will. When it moved, the sound was like the shattering of fragile crystal, a cacophony, both beautiful and jarring. The guardian raised a hand, and the path ahead blurred, fracturing into a maze of shifting illusions. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a resonance that filled Elaria's mind, bypassing her ears entirely. Step forward, child of the Silver Glade. To tread this path, you must face what lies within you. Fear is the shadow that binds. Break it or be broken. Before Elaria could respond, the guardian dissolved into shards of light, scattering into the maze. The silence that followed was deafening. Elaria chose the middle path, her instincts guiding her into the heart of the maze. As she walked, The crystalline walls grew higher, their edges sharp enough to cut light itself. The air became colder, and the hum that had followed her since the archway deepened into an almost mournful tone. Then the visions began. At first they were flickers in the corner of her eye, shadows that darted between the crystalline trees. But soon they took shape, forming figures she recognized with a jolt of pain. Her brother Kael lay before her, his lifeless form stretched across the path. His eyes, empty and accusing, seemed to pierce her very soul. "You failed me, Elaria," the vision said, its voice echoing like a lament. "You left me to fade," her breath caught, tears stinging her eyes. She reached out, but her hand passed through the vision, shattering it into shards that rained down like broken dreams. As she pressed onward, the visions grew darker. She saw her parents, their faces lined with grief, their kingdom in ruins. She saw herself, alone in a desolate forest, her cloak torn and her spirit broken. The weight of the illusions pressed down on her, each step heavier than the last. But somewhere within her, a flame flickered. The pendant around her neck grew warm, its faint glow cutting through the darkness of her doubts. Kael's real voice echoed in her memory, a fragment from a long ago day when they had braved a storm together. "Elaria, no storm lasts forever, and no shadow can snuff out the light we carry." The memory steadied her. She gripped the pendant tightly and faced the next vision head on. Her voice, clear and strong, rang out into the maze. "You are not real. You are my fears, my doubts, but you are not stronger than my love for Kael. I will not falter." The illusions dissolved like mist in sunlight. The maze shifted, the crystalline walls parting to reveal the end of the path. There, resting upon a pedestal of glowing crystal, was the first shard of light, a fragment of the Guardian itself. As Elaria reached out to take it, the warmth of the shard seeped into her palm, a silent acknowledgement of her triumph. The path forward reformed, but the silence was no longer oppressive. The garden, it seemed, had granted her passage deeper into its enigmatic depths. Elaria tightened her cloak around her shoulders and stepped forward, the shard glowing faintly in her hand. The trials were far from over, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. The garden stirred again. The next guardian awaited. The crystal shard in Elaria's hand pulsed faintly, its light rhythmic and alive, as though it carried the heartbeat of the guardian she had overcome. It warmed her fingers, but its weight was undeniable. As she ventured further into the garden, each step seemed to reverberate through the crystalline paths, the air shimmering with a sentience that grew heavier with every passing moment. The path opened into a vast clearing, its boundaries marked by towering, crystalline trees whose branches interlocked like a cathedral of glass. Light filtered through their translucent leaves, casting shifting patterns of color across the ground. In the center stood a new figure, smaller and more fluid than the first, yet no less imposing. This guardian took the shape of a crystalline wolf, its body an intricate lattice of gleaming shards, its eyes, twin orbs of glowing silver, fixed upon Elaria with a gaze that pierced straight through her defenses. When it moved, The air rang with the sound of delicate chimes, haunting and ethereal. Elaria's breath caught as the wolf lowered its head, its voice echoing not in sound, but in thought, resonating deep within her mind. Compassion is the binding thread of light. Without it, courage is hollow, a blade without purpose. Prove your heart's truth. With that, the wolf turned, padding silently toward a grove that seemed to appear from nowhere, its crystalline trees weaving themselves into a barrier behind it. The only way forward was to follow. The grove was unlike the rest of the garden. It was quiet here, the usual hum of the garden replaced by a stillness so profound that even Elaria's footsteps felt intrusive. The wolf stood in the center of a glade surrounded by smaller crystal creatures, delicate forms resembling foxes, deer, and birds. But something was wrong. Their bodies were shattered, their fragmented forms scattered across the ground like a broken mosaic. Elaria felt a pang of sorrow. The creatures, though lifeless, seemed to radiate an unspoken plea, their shards glinting faintly, as if yearning for wholeness. The wolf watched her intently, its eyes glowing with an inscrutable light. "Restore them," it commanded. "Show me the weight of your compassion." For a moment, Elaria hesitated. The task seemed insurmountable. The shards were countless, scattered far and wide, each piece jagged and fragile. Yet, as she knelt beside the nearest fragments, her hesitation melted away. These creatures, remnants of the garden's life, deserved her care. With delicate hands, she began to gather the pieces. Each shard felt cool and smooth against her fingertips. Yet as she worked, they grew warmer, as though responding to her touch. Hours seemed to pass, though time in the garden was impossible to measure. Slowly, painstakingly, she reconstructed a small bird, its crystalline feathers shimmering as it took shape. As she placed the final shard, the bird trembled, its wings unfolded, and with a single melodious chime, it rose into the air, whole once more. It circled Elaria once before perching on her shoulder, its tiny form radiating a gentle warmth. Encouraged, she turned to the others. A fox with a broken tail, a deer with missing antlers. One by one she mended them, her hands steady despite the growing ache in her arms. Each completed creature came to life, their movements graceful and otherworldly. They gathered around her, their restored forms glowing softly in the dim light of the grove. Finally, only one figure remained, a larger, more complex creature resembling a lion. Its shards were scattered farther than the others, and its reconstruction demanded every ounce of Elaria's patience and care. When she placed the final piece, the lion stood, towering over her, its crystalline mane refracting light in a dazzling display. It lowered its head, pressing its cool nose to her forehead in silent gratitude. The wolf approached, its silver eyes filled with something close to approval. "You have mended what was broken, not because you were commanded, but because your heart willed it." Compassion is not in word, but in deed. The garden deems you worthy. From the wolf's chest emerged another shard of light, larger and brighter than the first. It floated toward Elaria, settling into her hands with a gentle weight. As the shard fused with the one she already carried, a soft, harmonious hum filled the air. The creatures bowed their heads to her before retreating into the crystalline forest, their forms disappearing like shadows at dawn. The wolf stepped aside, revealing a path that led deeper into the garden. Elaria stood, weary yet emboldened. She clutched the fused shards to her chest, their warmth spreading through her like a quiet flame. The garden's whispers grew louder, guiding her toward the next trial. Her journey was far from over, but her heart now carried both courage and compassion, their light steady and unyielding against the enigmatic dark. The path ahead twisted and shimmered like a dream, the crystalline ground rippling beneath Elaria's feet as though it were a liquid mirror. The air grew cooler, the garden's whispers sharpening into a chorus of voices that spoke not in words but in feelings. Curiosity, wariness, and a subtle undertone of hope. Elaria followed the path, her steps resolute despite the growing weight of the fused shards around her neck. As she walked, the garden began to change. The vibrant, chaotic beauty of crystalline foliage gave way to an eerie stillness. Here, the trees were fewer, their trunks slender and translucent, rising like frozen flames into the prismatic sky. The light dimmed, casting long shadows that danced and flickered in patterns Elaria could not predict. At last, she reached the heart of the garden. The glade opened before her like a secret unveiled. It was a perfect circle, its edges bordered by delicate crystalline flowers that glowed faintly, their light forming an unbroken ring. In the center, upon a pedestal of pure, radiant crystal, stood the bloom of Lumina. Elaria gasped softly, her breath stolen by its beauty. The flower was unlike anything she had imagined. Its petals shimmered as though woven from starlight, each one a translucent veil of color that shifted and danced with every flicker of the garden's light. It seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm that echoed the very heartbeat of the world. But as she stepped forward, the air around her thickened. A low hum began to resonate, growing louder with each step. The garden was no longer watching, it was acting. The glade trembled, and from the ground rose the final guardian. It emerged as a towering figure, its form composed not of crystal, but of the same shifting light that glowed within the bloom of Lumina. Its edges were indistinct, flickering between solidity and vapor, and its face was a void of dazzling brilliance that Elaria could barely look upon. It radiated power, not menacing, but vast and inscrutable, like the deep ocean or the endless sky. The guardian extended a hand, and its voice filled the glade, not in sound, but in thought, its presence pressing against Elaria's mind. You have proven courage, you have shown compassion, but to claim the bloom of Lumina, you must answer its final question. What will you do with its power? Elaria hesitated, the question reverberating through her. What would she do? The answer seemed obvious. Save her brother, heal the light within him that was fading. But as she opened her mouth to speak, the guardian raised its other hand. The glade darkened and the visions began. Before her eyes, the garden revealed a fuchsia. She saw herself standing over her brother, the bloom of lumina glowing in her hands. Its light spread over Kael, restoring him to health, his laughter echoing through the halls of the palace. But the vision shifted, and she saw what came after. The flower's power draining, its light extinguished. The sickness that had plagued Kael spread beyond him, casting shadows over the Silver Glade. Her people, her kingdom, withered like leaves in a frost. The vision dissolved, replaced by another. This time, Elaria saw herself turning away from her brother, walking back to the palace with empty hands. Kael remained pale, his light fading completely. Yet the garden thrived, its power untouched, its magic continuing to pulse through the world. She saw the forest around the Silver Glade flourish, its creatures glowing with vitality. Her people mourned her brother, but the kingdom endured. The visions ended, and the guardian's gaze bore into her. Its silence was a question in itself. Elaria felt her chest tighten. The choice was unbearable, her brother's life or the balance of the world. She gripped the pendant around her neck, its warmth steadying her. Kael's voice echoed in her memory once more. No shadow can snuff out the light we carry. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling, but resolute. The bloom of lumina is not mine to claim for selfish reasons. Its power belongs to the garden, to the balance of this world. But I ask, no, I beg, let me take only what is needed to save Kael. Not all of it, just enough for one life, one light. The guardian remained still, its brilliance flickering like the final moments of a dying star. Then, slowly, it lowered its hand. The glade grew silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The bloom of lumina detached from its pedestal, floating toward Elaria. Its light dimmed, just slightly, as though it had given up a part of itself. As it settled into her hands, a warmth spread through her, a quiet assurance that the garden had heard her plea. The guardian faded, its form dissolving into the crystalline air. The glade brightened, the path back to the garden's entrance revealing itself. Elaria clutched the bloom of lumina to her chest, her heart filled with both relief and sorrow. Her trial was complete, but the journey was not yet over. She turned towards the path, her steps steady, her resolve unshaken. The garden hummed softly, as though bidding her farewell, and she began the long walk home. The journey back through the crystal garden felt both familiar and foreign. The paths she had trod now shifting subtly, as if the garden were gently guiding her away. The bloom of lumina nestled in her hands, its radiance dim yet steady, like a star holding its breath. The shards around her neck, fused during her trials, pulsed faintly in rhythm with the flower, their energies intertwined. Elaria's steps were deliberate, her heart weighed by the fragile balance she had dared to request. She had not taken all of the bloom's light, only a fragment, and though the guardian had permitted it, the consequences lingered in her mind. Could the sliver of power she carried truly be enough to save Kael? Would the garden's light falter because of her choice? The answers lay ahead, beyond the crystalline arch that shimmered in the distance. As she approached the archway, A soft wind stirred the air, carrying with it a faint, melodic hum. It was not the farewell of the garden, but a resonance that seemed to emanate from the bloom of Luminar itself. The flower pulsed gently, its light dancing across the crystalline structures around her, a quiet acknowledgement of her journey. When she stepped through the arch, the world changed. The suffocating stillness of the garden gave way to the vibrant hum of the Silver Glade. The sky stretched open, vast and deep, its stars no longer fractured but whole. Elaria paused, breathing deeply, the air crisp and alive. For the first time since entering the garden, she felt the weight of time return, pressing against her like an old friend. Her path back to the palace was quiet. The forest seemed to recognize her burden, its usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves subdued in reverence. As she neared the palace gates, she was met by the gentle glow of lanterns and the shadowed figures of guards who recognized her instantly. Their exclamations of relief were hushed, their eyes drawn to the flower she cradled, as though it were a piece of the moon itself. Elaria entered the royal chambers, her steps quickening as she approached Kael's bedside. Her parents were there, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope. The healers stood silently, their expressions unreadable, though their gazes flickered with awe as they caught sight of the bloom of Luminar. Kael lay as she had left him, his breath shallow, his face pale as frost. The sight struck her anew, her chest tightening with urgency. Elaria knelt beside him, holding the bloom above his heart. Its petals began to shimmer, their light growing as if stirred by her proximity. Closing her eyes, she whispered softly, her voice trembling yet firm. "Bloom of Luminar, hear my plea. Let your light mend his spirit, restore his strength, and rekindle his flame. Take only what you must, and leave the rest for the balance of this world." The flower responded. Its light spilled forth, golden and warm, washing over Kael like liquid sunlight. The glow sank into his chest, spreading outward in tendrils of radiant energy that banished the shadows clinging to him. His breaths grew deeper, steadier, as color returned to his cheeks. His eyes fluttered open, the dull gray giving way to the brilliant silver of life. "Elaria," he murmured, his voice hoarse but unmistakably alive. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned closer, her pendant brushing against him. "I'm here, Kael. You're safe." The room filled with a lightness, a sense of renewal that seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone present. The healers exchanged stunned glances, their disbelief tempered by joy. Her parents wept openly, their regal composure dissolving in the face of their son's recovery. When the light of the bloom of Luminar finally faded, the flower itself dissolved into motes of golden light, scattering like fireflies into the night. Elaria watched its final moments with a bittersweet ache. The garden had given what it could, and now the bloom was part of the ether once more. Kael's recovery was celebrated across the Silver Glade. The people sang songs of hope and whispered tales of the princess who braved the Crystal Garden. Yet, amidst the joy, Elaria felt the weight of her journey linger. The trials had marked her, their lessons etched deep within her soul. One evening, As she and Kael walked through the palace gardens, he paused and turned to her. "You risked everything for me," he said softly. "Why?" Elaria smiled faintly, the memory of the bloom's warmth flickering in her mind. "Because no shadow can snuff out the light we carry," she replied, her words steady with truth. "And some lights are worth every risk." Kael's laughter, bright and full, filled the air once more. Elaria joined him, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The bloom of Lumina was gone, but its light remained within her, within Kael, and within the world it had healed. The garden, she knew, would endure. Its mysteries would remain, its trials waiting for those brave and compassionate enough to seek its treasures. And though she hoped never to tread its paths again, Elaria carried its lessons with her, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light of love and sacrifice would always prevail.